1. Hi, my name is Kevin MOQUIN. After teaching in New York State as an elementary teacher for 33 years, I retired in 2015. In 2019, I received my doctoral degree from Syracuse University in teaching and curriculum. My dissertation was an in-depth study of 15 teachers' experiences of the professional development model called Japanese lesson study. The paper I presented here is based on that research. I've organized this PowerPoint from this video into 4 sections. In Section 1, I'll introduce lesson research study with a brief history. In Section 2, I will provide an explanation of the structure of my research. Section 3 represents my findings, and finally, Section 4 focuses on the implications or plausible insights I gained by my interpretations. But first, this research in a nutshell. This study examined 15 teachers' experiences of lesson study. 14 out of the 15 teachers believed that lesson study was the most effective form of professional development they had ever experienced in their careers. However, due to unintended obstacles within the United States professional development system, teachers described uneven experiences with lesson study. They pined for more top-down systemic support structures similar to their Japanese colleagues, but these are not available to teachers in the United States. This research describes this phenomena and offers plausible insights for the future lesson study practitioners. What is lesson study? Lesson study is both collaborative research and professional development. Educators engage in the process to increase their knowledge of content, standards, pedagogical techniques, or to solve targeted educational problems. It is applicable professional development. Teachers' classrooms become laboratories to collect data about their students. Findings from research lesson informs the profession and builds on previous knowledge and is employed at all levels in education, including the college level. The lesson study research process. According to Stigler and Hebert, the lesson study process includes 8 steps. Step 1, teacher-led teams define an educational problem. Step 2, they plan a research lesson. 3, teachers teach the research lesson to a live group of students in a classroom, and they collect data. Step 4, they debrief what they observed. Step 5, they revise that research lesson. Step 6, they reteach the research lesson to a different classroom of live students. Step 7, they debrief again, and finally, in Step 8, they report the findings. The lesson study process appears intuitively simple, yet at the same time, it is conceptually complex. Lesson study is a highly sophisticated professional learning community, and that involves collaboration. Success of the entire process hinges on the interpersonal skills of those involved. The foundational ideas of lesson study began in the United States at the State University of New York at Oswego, and that was in 1862. Dr. Edward Sheldon created a pedagogical approach called the Oswego movement, which spread throughout the United States in the 1860s and the 1890s. In the 1870s, one of Sheldon's graduate students, Hideo Takemine, imported this approach to Japan. Since that time, Japanese educators modernized the methods and altered it to reflect a more research-based orientation. Lesson study is one of the keystones of the Japanese educational system. One misconception about lesson study is that it cannot be done in the United States context because it is an exotic foreign idea. This misconception is ironic. It belies the historical roots of lesson study in the United States. In 1999, in their book titled The Teaching Gap, Stigler and Hebert introduced the modern version of the Oswego movement in the form of lesson study to teachers in the United States. They argued teaching is a culturally based profession and demonstrated the effectiveness of the Japanese approach, which was fueled by lesson study. This book motivated educators in the United States to implement lesson study. To help illustrate lesson study, this picture shows step 6 of the process. Teaching a lesson to a different class of students to study the tweaks made from the first iteration of the lesson. One benefit of lesson study, and this particular step in the process, is that it brings all educational stakeholders together in the context of a lesson, which is the main focus of the teaching profession. Stakeholders in this picture, who are also asked to observe and collect data to help teachers improve the lesson, include parents in the foreground, teachers sitting among the students gathering data, administrators, professors, and the main stakeholders themselves, the students. This slide shows examples of research lessons in the United States, one in the Midwest and the other in the Northeast. Lesson study practitioners are intensely interested in student thinking. The structure of the study. This was a brief introduction to lesson study. There's so much more to say and so much research available, but due to time, I will now switch my focus to the structure of my research. To start, my study was focused by the research question, how do teachers experience lesson study? This research was based on the interpretivist paradigm. The following components inherently align within this paradigm. The ontological and epistemological orientations that guided me was that multiple interpretations can emerge from a shared event, and that we construct meaning through experiences in the world, and these experiences are mediated by culture. My research goal was to understand, not predict or to generalize. My focus was on the specifics of what was unique or deviant. I attempted to uncover how participants thought, what they did, what kind of problems they experienced, and how they addressed those problems. The participant-researcher relationship was both interactive and cooperative. The following slides briefly explain my research components driven by interpretivism. My methodology was qualitative research. I used non-numerative interview data. My research design was hermeneutic phenomenology. Hermeneutics is the theory of interpretation. It is the art of understanding and of making oneself understood. Phenomenology seeks through systematic reflection to determine the essential properties of a phenomenon through the participant's retrospection of lived experience. Hermeneutic phenomenologists turn to a phenomena which seriously interests them and commits them to the world. My experience as a teacher, as a lesson study practitioner and facilitator placed me in this category. Hermeneutic phenomenologists investigate experience as it is lived rather than as it is conceptualized. We reflect on essential themes or life worlds which characterize the phenomenon. We describe the phenomenon through writing and rewriting. The final document must be written in language that is accessible and meaningful. We maintain a strong and oriented pedagogical relation to the phenomenon. My intention for this research was to gain knowledge to inform future lesson study practitioners. And we balance the research context by considering the parts to the whole to the parts cyclically by employing the hermeneutic circle. Methods. I was challenged to locate lesson study practitioners because in the United States, lesson study teachers work in isolated pockets, and this reality categorizes them as hidden populations. Snowball sampling is effective in reaching these populations. Through email and phone, I contacted 7 prominent lesson study researchers in the United States. Only 2 could provide context. Researcher A, 3 first wave contacts, and researcher B, 10 first wave contacts and 2 second wave contacts. Through snowball sampling, I was able to interview 11 female and 4 male educators. Years in education ranged from 7 had 25 plus years experience teaching, 4 had 20 to 25 years experience teaching, 1 had 15 to 20 years, and 3 had 5 to 15 years. Instructional levels varied from elementary school, middle school, high school, to college. And 4 had a combination of those levels. 9 out of the 15 participants were both lesson study facilitators and practitioners. I used semi-structured phone interviews with an average time of 54 minutes and 46 seconds. All interviews occurred during August and September of 2016. Instruments. To guide our conversation, I used an interview protocol for each participant. Often, participants would take the interview in a particular direction, which I encouraged. However, I made sure each question in the protocol was asked at some point in the conversation. Data collecting instruments included my iPhone with an app Tape-A-Call, and that was used for 12 interviews with the participants in the United States. For those outside of the United States, I used Skype audio on my iPad. To back up Tape-A-Call, I also recorded all the interviews with my computer using GarageBand. I transcribed the first interview myself and then employed Rev.com transcription services to produce the remaining transcripts of the interviews. To isolate thematic statements, I used Van Manen's procedures. First, I iteratively read the transcripts holistically, looking for sententious statements and getting an idea of the big picture. Second, I used the selective highlighting approach. What phrases stood out? What sentences or parts of sentences seemed to be thematic? Third, I applied the detailed line-by-line approach. I read each sentence or sentence clusters. Fourth, I consolidated these sentences into meaning units, and these meaning units were placed into en vivo software. Fifth, I consolidated the meaning units into life world existentials, which were, the four were lived spaced, lived body, lived time, and lived human relation. Finally, I produced a final document after numerous drafts, many drafts. Addressing issues of trustworthiness and authenticity, I frequently debriefed with professors. I explicated my data collecting procedures and analytical processes and linking them to established research procedures. I used bracketing to address my biases. And I believe my experiences as a lesson study practitioner and a teacher, and later as a lesson study facilitator, served to inform this study. Furthermore, I consistently, throughout each step of the process, applied reflexive thematic analysis. And finally, the last section, findings. This research produced 3 data patterns. 1, participants' experience of professional development prior to their work with lesson study. 2, participants' perceptions of how lesson study positively affected their professional development events. And 3, participants' experiences of obstacles that impeded their lesson study efforts. This paper focused on the 3rd pattern. First, though, I want to briefly summarize the first 2 data patterns before moving to the main theme of this paper about the obstacles to lesson study. Professional development before lesson study was a theme relevant to this research because it served as a means of a before and after comparison. With some exceptions, generally, participants reported their professional development experiences before lesson study were a cacophony of competing, random, inapplicable events devoid of mechanisms to sustain their new knowledge. However, they also described what was effective in their professional development prior to lesson study. In describing what they found, the participants unintentionally talked about some of the features inherent to lesson study research cycles, which are access to experts, focus on content, focus on student achievement, it was applicable, it was sustained, and it leveraged productive collaboration. In this way, the participants were predisposed to key features of lesson study. This may have been a contributing factor in their preference for lesson study as an approach to professional development. Now, the second data pattern was about their positive experiences of lesson study, and when I gathered this data, it validated previous research. So participants reported confidence in the lesson study process. They reported increased knowledge of content and standards. It helped develop trust within lesson study teams. It increased feelings of professionalism. Their shared experiences with lesson study fostered a common knowledge about students, and it increased their cognitive empathy for their students. Moving from the second pattern about the benefits of lesson study now to the obstacles. The third pattern regarding obstacles to lesson study both validated previous research and produced new knowledge. Regarding the validation of previous research, that teachers felt angst about being out of the classroom, away from their students to attend lesson study events. Some lesson study groups lacked integrity to the structured systematic process. They left out steps. A huge issue was time. It takes 7 weeks to engage in this entire process, the entire cycle. The novelty of the research lesson also produced misconceptions. That was step 6 of the process. Also, teachers felt vulnerable to being observed by their colleagues. Lesson study competed with other initiatives. And teachers had misconceptions about the entire process. They couldn't understand what's the fuss over one lesson. So this was a type of conflicting cultures. Teachers in the United States had difficulty shifting to the researcher mindset. This next area is critical to this research because this is what produced new knowledge for our knowledge of lesson study in the United States context. So I placed these new contributions to the literature about lesson study articles in 2 categories. 1, the power of internal dynamics that prevent teacher learning during lesson study research cycles. And 2, the disruptive influence of principal turnover on lesson study. The power of internal dynamics. Participants explained in detail their internal conflicts within lesson study teams. A second data pattern in this category: factions in learning communities between lesson study practitioners, teachers who did not want lesson study to be employed in the school, and teachers wavering between the first two factions. 3, political issues between lesson study facilitators and their administrators. And 4, conflicts between administrators about lesson study. One principal was even fired over lesson study. The disruptive influence of principal turnover. Principals supportive of lesson study who left their building for other positions or for whatever reason caused much upheaval on lesson study teams. 2, new principals with superficial knowledge of lesson study who came into the building practicing lesson study could not provide sufficient theoretical, logistical, and interpersonal support structures to sustain the lesson study teams. 3, lesson study was rejected in the wider community due to principal-fueled initiative fatigue. New principals championing new initiatives, or what some teachers called fads, were perceived as self-promoters, and lesson study was misconceived to be in this category. Plausible insights and implications of this research. Plausible insights about importing lesson study in the United States context. Lesson study facilitators need to explicitly address the politics of lesson study when considering the wider learning community before they implement lesson study in their buildings. Stakeholders should seek the assistance of the disciplines with the expertise in the professional collaboration area and psychology to address the internal dynamics obstacle. For sustainability, a robust professional development partnership is required between lesson study facilitators and administrators. And further, this robust professional development can include using the list of lesson study obstacles as a springboard for discussions before employing lesson study in their learning communities. The limitations of this study. The findings in this study are not generalizable, yet they still can be used to inform lesson study practitioners and those engaged in group-based professional development. 2, there's a possibility of reporter bias occurred because all participants in this study were supportive of lesson study. 3, interviews were limited to those who had lesson study experience and were willing to talk with me. 4, limitations of snowball sampling. Interviewing administrators in these settings would have been ideal. However, I looked for negative case samples and I was not able to find them. So 5, we need case studies of these settings. Quite possibly, the participants in this study experienced accountability as a state of being. These educators found a professional development model based on an American idea, carefully developed by their Japanese colleagues, and this model provided them with a structured process to increase their professional knowledge and their teaching capacities. They believe lesson study to be a humanistic, intrinsically based accountability system that offered a type of quality control and at the same time increased their feelings of professionalism. From the bottom up, these teachers pined for more top-down support to address the obstacles in the system that impeded their development. Yet, given the complex challenges that confront administrators, given the critical role they play in building school cultures and positive school climates, administrators cannot be expected to provide support if they do not understand the benefits, the nuances, and the logistical requirements of lesson study. If this approach is to be sustained in the United States context, including administrators in professional development about lesson study must be a primary focus. And I thank you for listening.